This week we'll be talking about Unit 4, which deals with perception and the perception process. How do our perceptions affect our communication with others? Perception does affect communication, and we begin to answer these questions of how by taking a look at the way we make sense of the world. Each of us in our everyday life experiences a slightly different reality. For example, if you take the word cold, it means different things to different people in different parts of the country, depending on if you're Southern California or if you live in Maine. In this chapter, we will help you to look at the world from others' eyes in order to improve your communication. Reality is constructed. In order to understand how this works, we must recognize that there are two levels of reality, which we have labeled first order and second order. First order realities are physically observable qualities of a thing or situation. By contrast, the second order realities involve our attaching meaning to the first order things or situations. The second order realities don't reside in the objects or the events, but rather in our minds. So first order reality would be a job interviewer asks if you're married. If we have a shared second order reality, we both agree that this is a reasonable question for the situation. Communication becomes more problematic when we have differing second order realities. For example, first order reality again, a job interviewer asks if you're married. Your second order reality, this job has nothing to do with, or this question has nothing to do with the job and is inappropriate, versus the interviewer's second order reality, I was just trying to make conversation. In addition, many communication problems can arise when we make or mistake second order realities for our first order ones. We attach meaning to our experiences in 4 stages of the perception process. These are selection, organization, interpretation, and negotiation. Let's start with selection. Because we're exposed to more input than we can possibly manage, the first step in perception is selection, or determining what data you're going to attend to. Several factors cause us to notice some stages while ignoring others. So intensity, something that is louder, larger, or brighter, tends to stand out more. Repetition, something that is repeated over and over, can also attract our attention. Contrast or change. Unchanging people or things are less noticeable, but when things do change and are outside of the norm, we pay more attention to them. Also motives. I tend to pay attention to things that I'm more interested in as opposed to those that you are not. After selecting information from the environment, the next stage is organization, or arranging it in some meaningful way. This helps us to make sense of the world and allows us to classify things. How do we classify things? We organize them using perceptual schema, cognitive frameworks. These various types of perceptual schema help us to classify others, and we tend to classify them according to social roles, appearance, membership, and other things. Once we have selected an organizing scheme to classify people with, we use it to make generalizations about the members of the group that fit our categories as well. After the organization and selection of our perceptions, we interpret them in some way that makes sense to us. We attach meaning to this sense data, which plays a role in virtually every interpersonal act. Is the person who smiles at you from across a crowded room interested in romance or just being polite? Is your friend's kidding a sign of affection or that they're irritated? Several factors can cause us to interpret a person's behavior in one way over another. Thus, some of the factors that influence our interpretation are involvement, how involved we are in something, our past experiences. If you've been taken advantage by landlords in the past, you might be skeptical about the ability to reclaim your deposit in the future. stereotyping, knowledge, how much you know about something, expectations. If you go into a conversation expecting a hostile attitude, you're likely to hear a negative tone in the other person's voice, even if it isn't there. Assumptions. We have a tendency to assume things about human behavior. Do you assume people are lazy and dislike work, or do you believe people generally exercise self-direction and self-control? Our attitudes about things and our self-concept and personality. All of these are factors that influence the way that we see the world and that we make sense of it. Negotiation is the last step in this process. This occurs among people as they influence one another's perception and try to have a shared understanding. In Chapter 1, you read that meaning is created both in and among people. So negotiation is the process by which communication influences one another's perceptions. Narratives are the stories we use to describe our personal worlds. So they are our stories, and they help us to describe to other people what our personal world feels like. A variety of different factors influence how we select, organize, interpret, and negotiate data about others. The available information affects our perceptual judgments, as do psychological, cultural, and social, and physiological factors. One of the first things that influences our perception is physiological. This can include your senses, how you hear, taste, touch, and see things. Your age. We experience the world differently throughout our lifetimes. Age alters not just our bodies, but our perspectives. Your health. Recall the last time you came down with a cold or flu. Health can have a strong impact on how you perceive and relate to others. Fatigue and tiredness. Even hunger. You probably heard the term hangry before. Additionally, gender roles, occupational roles, what you do for a living can influence your perception. Your self-concept, biological cycles. Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person or a night owl? And your cultural influences. All of these can influence the way that we see the world and what our perception is of things. Now, it's obvious that many factors affect the way we interpret the world. Social scientists use the term attribution to describe the process of attaching meaning to behavior. We attribute meaning to both our own actions and the actions of others, but quite often we're using different rulers to do so. What are some of the different perceptual tendencies that may lead to inaccurate information? The first is we make snap judgments, and quite often our snap judgments can be wrong and or based on stereotypes. Second, we cling to first impressions. Snap judgments are significant because our initial impressions of others often carry more weight than the ones that follow. This is due to what's called the primacy effect. Once we form our first impression, whether it's positive or negative, we are susceptible to confirmation bias, where we tend to seek out and organize our impressions to support that opinion. Additionally, we judge ourselves more charitably than we do others. This is called the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to give more weight to personal qualities than to the situation when making attributions. This self-serving bias means that when we perform poorly, we usually blame external forces, but when we perform well, we credit ourselves rather than the situation. We also have a tendency to see ourselves in a more charitable light. We pay attention to others' negatives. We are also influenced by that which is the most obvious. As you read earlier, we select stimuli from our environment that are noticeable. So we tend to grab onto that which might be the most obvious. We are also influenced by our expectations, and we have a tendency to assume that everyone else is just like us. Given the likelihood for perceptual errors, it's easy to see how a communicator can leap to the wrong conclusion and make inaccurate assumptions. So for example, we're going to talk about the perception check. The skill of perception checking provides a better way to review your assumptions and to share your interpretation. A complete perception check has 3 parts: a description of the behavior you noticed, 2 possible interpretations of the behavior, and a request for clarification about how to interpret the behavior. Perception checks look a little bit like this. Hey, you said you really liked the job that I did. Behavior. But there was something about your voice that made me think you may not like it. First interpretation. Maybe it's just my imagination though. Second interpretation. How do you really feel? Request for clarification. Perception checking is a tool to help us understand others accurately instead of assuming that our first interpretation is correct.